Sweet dreams are made of this.
My father and my uncle had this experience when they were kids. Fair warning, it might get a bit lengthy. My father and his elder brother, my uncle, were like best friends from childhood. My father used to live in a joint family and used to live in a very small village called Maharashtra State, India. The village is located a bit in the jungle with a population of hardly 500 to 800 people at the time. Farming was the main occupation with little to no electricity and also a lack of wall clocks, so they used to decide on their time according to the daylight. It was around 1966 or so. Now, I know it sounds like medieval times, but that was the situation for tribal people in India. So my father, then 8 or 10 years old, and my uncle, then 15 or 16, used to get up early in the morning, like around 4 a.m, and used to go into the jungle to cut the wood for daily needs like cooking, etc. But before that, my aunt, their elder sister, used to make some breakfast for them, like bhakri, which is a kind of Indian bread, and sabji, curry. She either used to pack a tiffin for them so they could eat later, or used to deliver the food by herself in early dawn with my grandfather, who used to start the farm's work. The jungle was near the farms, and my father and uncle would go to a familiar area of the jungle which my aunt was very well aware of. She used to track them down easily, have their breakfast together, and then come back together with the wood logs. One day my uncle and father got up early in the morning as usual. It was still dark, and it was winter. Sunrise is a bit late during this season. My aunt was still sleeping, so they decided not to disturb her, and they picked up their axes and went for the jungle. That day, they decided to go a bit further than usual in the jungle, but in reality, they went way too far. They were not even able to see the lantern lights of the village. They started cutting a tree and gathering little sticks from around. They got very busy and concentrated for the time being. After 1.5 hours or so, my uncle got very suspicious as to why the sun was not rising yet. By this time, there were supposed to be birds starting to sing, and no rooster was making that typical morning noise. No cattle were mooing, which comes along with the shepherds. All that there was an eerie, deep silence. It was so silent, in fact, that my uncle got worried that they were more early than usual time, so he started to hurry up in his work. Now, before going on any further, let me be very clear about my uncle. He is a very tough guy. Nothing scares off the dude easily, and is respected by the whole village. Same goes for my father. But this time it was different. He didn't know why, but he was feeling that there was something very wrong, and something is watching them from deep jungle, and my uncle knew it better. It was not some tiger, cheetah, jaguar, or wild boar. He felt something was wrong that day, and then, all of a sudden, my father and uncle heard the voice of my aunt from a long distance. They couldn't see her, it was just a voice. My uncle got very suspicious, as the voice was coming from deep jungle, and not from the direction of the village. My uncle told my father to tell her to come to them, so my father responded to her voice, and told her to come to them. The voice stopped for a moment, and then she replied, "No, you come to me, hurry! I've brought you your favorite food." At this moment, my uncle realized what it is. He had heard a lot of stories from the villages of a voice which takes away people, sometimes never to be found again, or, if found, will be in a suicidal mental state. The locals used to call such paranormal entities as chakva, meaning the paranormal being who will hypnotically fool you to commit suicide. As soon as my uncle snapped out of his thoughts, he realized that my father, being a naive kid, started walking towards the voice and started responding to my aunt's, or the entity's, voice. It was taking my father's name and yelling, "Come to this direction. I'm waiting here with the breakfast." My uncle ran towards my father with full speed, grabbed him by his shirt collar and said, "Don't listen to her. Come on, we must go home." My father said, "But it's elder sister. She's calling us. I am hungry." By that time, my uncle has already grabbed my father's hand and told him, "She's bluffing with us. She has no food. Now come on." Now my father was about to start arguing with my uncle, but then he looked into my uncle's eyes. He certainly looked scared and his hand was shaking. Father too sensed that something was wrong and started walking fast towards the village, without a word uttered. "Why are you going towards that side? Come here, follow my voice," she said. My uncle, still holding my father's hand, said, "Ignore her. She's not coming to us anyway." No need to say he was trying to divert my father's attention and play it cool, so that he doesn't panic. As they were walking towards the village, they felt like as if it was an eternity to get there. Now, being a Hindu by religion, my uncle started mumbling mantras of Lord Rama, a Hindu god. The voice slowly started fading away as they were coming close to the village. My uncle took a long sigh of relief when the dog started barking all of a sudden from the village direction, and noticing that some of the village lamps were close by. The whole village's dogs gathered together and started barking and making that loud crying noise, like wolves. My uncle reckons the entity might have still been following them. My uncle and father almost started running towards the village, and finally reached the village. The voice was long gone, and there was this sense of light-heartedness. My uncle stopped near our ancestral temple, joined his hand, bowed his head and said thank you. My father was still confused of the situation. Once they reached home, my uncle and father saw that my aunt was still in her bed. Father, being a naive child, cursed her for beating them in the race. Turns out they both left the house way too early, as in at 2 a.m. or even earlier. And it was a no moon night, so it was dark already. My father got a fever for a few days, when my aunt told him that she didn't get up that morning, let alone making their food. But my grandfather and uncle knew better, and are thankful to God to this day. This happened to me while I was in college, 20 plus years ago, and I never forgot it. It was one of the first times I ever remember seeing true fear and panic on someone's face. This part will only spatially make sense if you are familiar with Monterey, California. I lived in the seaside area, and my college girlfriend lived in Carmel Valley. Sometimes when I would drive her home late at night, we would take a lightly used roadway called Laurelus Grade. It was long, dark, and full of winding turns. It also led us out near her house, so it was a minor time saver. We were driving home late one night, and we were chatting and laughing about something or another, as we usually did on the ride, when she looks out the window, stops mid-sentence, screams, then looks forward and yells, "Go, go, go." She is terrified. I floor it and ask her what is happening, and she won't talk. She is literally next to me, hyperventilating. I drove unsafely fast through the twists and turns of the road, and a few minutes later slowed down, assuming that whatever scared her was fast in our rear view. By this point, she's calmed down a bit as well, and I ask her again what happened. Her first reply was, "You didn't see it?" Then she proceeds to tell me that as we were driving around a corner, she was looking out the window, and my headlights lit up a human-looking animal, standing along the side of the road, disjointedly on all fours, with a human-looking face that looked like it was hissing. My first reaction was that it might actually be a hurt person, or maybe we should go back or call 911. But she was adamant that no, it was not a person, and there was no way we were going back. We got back to her house a few minutes later and out of extra precaution called the local police and asked them to go and check the area. We never had any follow-up from them. Fast forward several years, 15 or so, and I was telling a co-worker who was from that area about the incident. She got really spooked, and when I finished, she told me that Laurelus Grade was known for strange sightings and is a spot that UFO fanatics tend to go to, which I thought was interesting. I was little, like kindergarten, starting first grade little. I lived in Germany at the time, due to being an army brat. My little sister is 2 years younger than me, so we did everything together. We lived in a 2-story farmhouse-style home, and me and my little sister were playing in our room. I don't remember when he came, but we started playing with a boy a little older than us. I don't remember ever seeing him, just talking to him and playing games and other kids' stuff. Me and my sister would later realize that the little farm boy was kind of an asshole, because he would turn off the lights in whatever room we were in, mostly our bedroom, and lock the doors. We would find each other in the dark, scared, but a little annoyed. I remember telling my sister to try and find the light, and I'll get the door. They were both next to each other. I couldn't open the door and began to bang on it, when my sister, in a panic voice, said that she couldn't find the light. I was kind of mad scared and thought she was pulling my leg, and she was small, so I was like, "Move over, let me try." I felt around the area where I knew the light switch would be, but I only found wall. Confused, I decided to find the bottom of the wall, use both my hands, and slide them all the way up, as high as I could. Nothing. Then I told my sister to do what I just did, and I would do the same at top, but we would do a slow, zigzag pattern just in case we weren't going far enough. Our hands eventually grazed each other, and we realized we wouldn't find the dumb thing. So I turned back to the door and ordered my little sister to bang on the door and scream. We did this for what felt like forever. I was even more confused because Mum should be making dinner right now, and Dad would be getting home soon, or he already was. My other older sisters were never home, so they weren't on my list. Me and my little sister started to give up, thinking this was our life now, in the dark, next to the door. We weren't about to go into the abyss behind us. Then, all of a sudden, our mum came to the door, and we shouted that we were stuck. Dad got us out, and me and little sister were pissed. We thought that they were being mean and meant to do that to us, and started yelling at them. "Didn't you hear us? We were shouting and smacking the door." They looked at us, confused, and said they never heard anything. We told them about Farm Boy, and that we didn't want to play with him if he kept doing that. I have a few more stories about him if you all want to know. I still feel quite miffed about some of the stuff he did, but we still played with him till we left. When I was younger, I used to be obsessed with ghosts and all sorts of haunting shows. Now, I'd never particularly had a reason to believe my house was haunted, but one day my brother came home claiming to have found $10 out of nowhere. I'll never know for sure if he was just messing with me, but after curiosity got the best of me, I asked him where he really got the $10 from. Stupid me assumed maybe a friend. Perhaps he stole it from my parents' wallet. My parents never claimed to have been missing any money, however. Something they would have definitely voiced distraught about if they'd noticed we'd taken their cash. The story he gave me was that a young girl, about the age of 7, had followed him onto the school bus that afternoon. He'd never met this girl and had never seen her around at school, but she decided to sit in the seat in front of him. After riding the bus for a little while, she started to talk to him. Nobody else could see her, according to him, and other kids were giving him looks. Eventually, she handed him $10 with a note, and then, subsequently, got off the bus at the next stop. I immediately assumed he was lying and laughed, of course. I asked him to show me the note, which he promptly pulled out from his room and passed me a tiny piece of paper. A shiver ran down my spine, as the note wasn't in his handwriting, but in the handwriting of what I could only assume to be a young child. It read, "I'll help you, but only this time," which I believe was in response to the facts that my brother was begging my parents for a Zelda charm bracelet for months, which they refused to buy him. Given that he had $10 now, he could just buy it himself though. Of course, me being me, was extremely intrigued by this, even if it seemed absurd. I suggested we make a makeshift Ouija board and see if we can contact anyone. So we wrote the alphabet on a piece of paper and grabbed a necklace to hover over the DIY board. My brother was interested too, so he had told me it could be fun. Mind you, I was in the 6th grade and he was in the 4th at the time, so any sort of movement from the necklace caught our attention, and we immediately thought it was a ghost. After asking a few questions, the necklace began to move and shake. Either my brother was really good at tricking me by slowly sliding the necklace across the board, or it really was something paranormal. We were able to get a name, Kate, after asking dumb things like, "Did you watch me complete the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time?" And getting a yes, me and my brother decided to stop for the night after being creeped out. We'd never said goodbye before ending though. Eventually, playing with the board would be a daily occurrence. We thought we'd made a friend and truly believed that someone was talking to us. Me and my brother decided to take things a step further and try to record something. So we got both our tablets, placed them in front of our TV and hit record. The first thing I asked was, if someone's here, move something in the room. Nothing. Okay, well, maybe the ghost is shy. We decided to ask the same question, but this time we said we'll leave the room to give it time. We went downstairs for 5 minutes, and when we got back upstairs, our tablets had both fallen to the floor and stopped recording. Maybe a coincidence? I mean, things fall, especially when you're not careful at placing them. So we brushed it off. In December of 6th grade though, things got weird. I'd started hearing voices in my head, claiming that they were the ghost I was talking to while playing the Ouija board. I'd gotten so scared one night, I'd grabbed the Bible one of my religious friends had gifted me. I'm not religious, and would sleep with it. Eventually I told my mum that there was a ghost telling me scary things. I won't get into detail as some of it was a little graphic. She and my dad argued for a while about whether or not I was schizophrenic, and if I should see a therapist. So out of fear, I never told them I was hearing voices again. But I'd space out often, talking and having conversations with this thing I believed to be a ghost. Eventually, I forgot about the ghost, and we'd no longer talked. I will never know what that voice was, if I was genuinely insane, if they were just intrusive thoughts. I was just glad for it to have stopped. Nothing necessarily paranormal has happened to me since, besides my TV turning on randomly in the middle of the night, or the feeling of someone pushing my legs with some sort of unknown force every once in a while. But I do still have this looming feeling that Ever since I've played with that Ouija board, I have some sort of spirit attached to me, following me. Not a bad one, but just a looming presence. When I was around 10 years old, I lived with my dad and his new wife, part-time. I woke up in the morning around 5 a.m. and walked out to the living room after hearing a repetitive noise, thinking it was my stepmom, who often had problems sleeping, which resulted in her waking up early or staying up late. When I walked into the living room, I saw a shadow in the kitchen, making a noise that sounded like a spoon hitting the side of an empty bowl. I don't know why, but I figured it was my stepmom making pudding. I stared for a while and thought it was weird she was doing this without the lights on, and even weirder that the more I stared at her, the more I realized that I wasn't able to make out any of her features. I remember thinking she looked like she was made up of the colors you see when you close your eyes. After staring for a while and trying to make out what I saw, I called out to her, and the mixing sound stopped. I stood and stared a little while longer, before I realized that it wasn't my stepmom in the kitchen. I ran back to my room and covered my head with my blanket, not daring to close the door because my parents kept bells on the door, and they would have made too much noise. After hiding under my covers for a few moments, and trying to convince myself that it was nothing, I decided to peek out. To my horror, I saw the same shadow figure walk into my doorway. I hid myself back under the covers and hyperventilated until I fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I asked my stepmom if she was awake and in the kitchen earlier, which she denied, confused. I ended up telling my mum about it when she picked me up, and to this day she teases me about the mixing bowl ghost. I always thought it was a ghost until I saw someone mention shadow people in this subreddit. This story isn't mine, but one that was told to me by my nanny, more like a grandma figure to me when I was younger. This story has stuck with me vividly all these years. In this story, I'll call my nanny Sarah. Sarah was a teenager in the 60s, and she was with her mum visiting family out in the country. They were staying in a house with Sarah's uncle, aunt, and 2 cousins. One summer night, Sarah and her cousins, both girls also teenagers, were out late drinking beer. They started their drive home around 1 a.m. They were about 30 minutes away from their house, going straight along a rural road that went on for miles. It was pitch black with no streetlights, and they were about 10 minutes away from the house when they noticed a truck was behind them. At first, they thought nothing of it, but the truck continued to get closer and closer until it was right on their tail. Sarah and her cousins began freaking out and driving faster, but so did the truck. Then, it turned on its brights. Sarah told me they just kept driving faster and faster, but the truck kept following them. It was so bright, they could barely see. Finally, they got to the house and turned onto the dirt road it was on. A bad decision they were about to realize. The dirt road only had one access point to the road they were coming from. As soon as Sarah and her cousins pulled in towards the house, the truck pulled into the driveway and swerved sideways, blocking the only exit. 3 men slowly got out of the car, holding large objects that Sarah couldn't quite make out. At this point, it was nearly 1:30 a.m. when Sarah heard her mother screaming from the house, "Sarah, run!" Sarah and her cousins bolted into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind them. Only moments later, the doorknob began rattling, and the men began banging on the door. The men began walking around the house, trying to get into every window they could find. After about 30 harrowing minutes, they seemingly gave up. I guess they didn't have a phone at the time, so they had no way to call for help. The biggest question Sarah had was, why was her mum awake in the middle of the night? And how was she outside at just the right time? She had no way of knowing that Sarah was in trouble. Sarah's mum said she had a dream that something bad was going to happen to Sarah, and she woke up in a sweat with a terrible feeling. She went outside to see if their car was back, to see if they made it home safe, and that's when they pulled into the driveway. I finally decided to post this life-changing and defining experience that I had when I was about 9 or 10 years old. When I say life-changing and defining, I truly do mean that. Ever since I had this experience, I have had an obsession with the other world. And I know in my heart that there is a lot more to this earth than what we can see with our eyes. I had a lot of really strange experiences at this property, but what I am writing about was the beginning of a weird few years. So backtrack around 13 years ago, and I'm 9 or 10 years old. My parents and I had just moved up to a mountain in the Gold Coast hinterland, Tamborine Mountain, in Australia. Absolutely beautiful place, full of national parks and tropical rainforests. To explain the layout of our property, there was the main house, and about 100 meters to the left of the main house was a large shed. Separating the main house from the shed was a garden area, with a little path leading from the shed to the house. It was just after dark, maybe 7 p.m. My mum was inside the main house making dinner, and for some reason, I was outside with my dad at the shed whilst he was unloading things from the back of a truck with one of his mates. I helped for a little bit, but when it came to the bigger objects, I was just sitting around and admiring our beautiful new property. I can still remember this like it happened yesterday. So I'm sitting down and waiting for my dad to finish up so we can go back to the main house. And for some reason, and to this day I still do not know why, I had this intense urge to look over to my right into the bushes, which separated the main house from the shed. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it was not a trick of the light or my imagination. About 30 feet away from me was a small thing, walking parallel to where I was sitting, wading through the bushes. It was walking at a normal pace, but pushing the bushes back to make way for itself. I could only see the side profile of this thing, but I could see that over its body it was wearing something black, almost like a black cloak. From the side profile of its face, I could make out a pointed nose with sharp cheekbones, and a large hole where I'm assuming its eye was. It was probably about 3 or 4 feet high, and had the stature of a small child. I saw it for probably about 5 seconds. I think that it was probably the first time in my life I had an adrenaline rush. My heart dropped to my stomach and I felt sick and confused. I couldn't speak or move. All I could feel was utter fear and terror, and this thing. I stood up and quickly bolted inside the shed and waited for my dad to finish up, because no way in hell was I going to walk back to the house by myself. It never looked at me. For all I know, it could have been before, but when I saw it did not look at me or acknowledge me. I didn't sleep in my own bed until I was 13 after that experience. I was utterly shit scared of the dark, and still to this day I don't like going outside after dark by myself. The older I got, the more I began to research paranormal topics. I tried for so long to convince myself that this was just a hallucination, but I know in my heart it wasn't. The best description that I could give it would be, it looked like an alien grey, but the thing still had proportionate features, if that makes sense. I know this sounds insane, but it had the features of a goblin. Pointed ears and a sharp cheekbone. It was definitely wearing something black over the top of its shoulders, as I did not see its legs. The most messed up aspect of this experience for me is that to this day, I still have weird nightmares about that property. I've never forgotten that night, or how it has molded and changed my perception of this world. There is so much more out there that we don't know about. Has anyone else ever had an experience similar to this? I had a haunting 9 years ago. I was a single mother with a 2-year-old boy and my 9-year-old niece. I had gotten custody of my niece due to her mother being an addict. We just moved into a nice apartment and I was so excited to be able to give my kids a nice place. It was newly redone. New carpet, new walls, new trim, new everything. It was a weird setup though. When you walked in, my bedroom was on the right, living room on the left, and dining room straight ahead. To the left of the dining room was a smaller bedroom which also had its own full bathroom. I think it was more for roommates than a family. I started having paranormal encounters the same day we moved in, so I always left both bedroom doors open at night so I could see into the kids' room past the dining table. From the start, I would wake up at 3:12 a.m. every night. A lot of times, my son would too, but would start crying. I would wake up to an old woman in my room. She would always stand in the hall that led to the master bathroom. She would always try to talk to me. I could never hear her. Then my son would cry and I'd go comfort him and go back to bed. But sleep was hard to come by for me. As time went on, she would bang on the walls where the water heater was, jiggle door handles, knock photos off the wall, wake me up every single night at 3:12 a.m. She got more and more angry that I wasn't doing what she wanted, I guess. So eventually, she started appearing as a black smoke-like mass. She would get closer and closer, mumbling something I couldn't make out. My cat would flee. I could feel her anger. I could feel the tension and frustration thick in the air. When she wasn't that black mass, she appeared more tattered and unkempt. Her hair would be a mess when it was once done up so nicely. She would look so tired, sunken in eyes, and became more and more frightening. Her behavior was downright aggressive. The banging became so loud that neighbors could hear it. She would rattle the doors violently. I thought someone was trying to break in, but no one was ever there. My dreams were cruel torments of me being raped, murdered, having my children kidnapped, every night. There weren't many nights that I didn't cry myself to sleep. I was doing my best to raise 2 kids, one of which wasn't mine. Work a full-time job and then come home to so much negative energy. I decided to ask my neighbors about previous tenants, as they'd lived there for years. Apparently, a woman took care of her elderly mother. Her mother died in my room. The apartment was totally redone because that woman literally had to wallow in her own feces. The daughter was very neglectful, and the pets were also never cleaned up after. I also found out the reason I was able to afford that apartment was because the rent was significantly lower than other identical units. The manager of the apartments never told me any of this. Shortly after, I woke up again at 3:12 a.m. But instead of the old woman or blackness, I saw my son squatting on a dining room chair. I said, "Troy, why are you up?" He looked me straight in the eyes, smiled his sweet smile and whispered, "Mama." I got up to get him. As I reached out for him, he just vanished. My heart sank. I couldn't breathe. I thought something happened to him. I ran into the kids' room and they were both fine, sleeping away. I cried until I was totally exhausted and finally fell asleep. That's when I decided to break my lease and move. She would unpack boxes. She would hide things. She would turn the bathroom light off when I was in the shower. She was trying desperately to talk to me, and I had no idea how to listen. I mourned for her. I could feel her pain, but I also had a family to take care of. I had my stuff packed and moved in under a week. If you have any idea what it's like to be a single parent with 2 kids and a full-time job, then you know that was an amazing feat. I had a dream after we moved that there was a diary hidden behind a water tank. Why I never thought to look in there, when that was where she kept banging. I just hope she found peace. My story starts with coming back from the store with my family. In my village, an entire new neighborhood was being built. Mind you, I live in an area that used to have a lot of forest around me, which has since been destroyed due to people building houses. There was a dirt and gravel road in the middle of the woods from the main road that led to a shortcut to my house. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and I distinctly remember sitting in the middle seat in the middle row of our family minivan. So I got a clear view in between the driver's seat and the passenger's seat. I was talking with my younger siblings, goofing off, and I looked up to see it crouched on the road. It looked almost exactly like the picture you get when you Google the rake. It had pale grey skin. It was freakishly slender, and it had eyes like reflectors. I freaked out and screamed out, saying something along the lines of, "What is that?" And both of my parents turned around, asking what I was talking about. I burst into tears and see it run over behind a tree. It's so tall. I see it peek from the tree a couple of times and explain what it looked like to my mum while hysterical. My mum didn't believe me at all and got mad at me for trying to scare my siblings. Around that time, I used to watch a lot of those ghosts caught on tape type stuff on YouTube, and I'd show my younger siblings, which resulted in many nightmares for them. My dad, on the other hand, said it was probably just a deer. It looked nothing like a deer. I still remember those eyes. When we passed by the tree I saw it run behind, nothing was there. It was completely dark. I thought I must have imagined it, until my dad told me he saw something too when we got home. He told me he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but didn't get a good look since I started screaming and he turned around to look at me. To this day, it still scares me, and I never walk too close to the woods at night. This happened in the winter of 2015. For context, I had just flown back home to Germany for winter break from uni in America, and naturally had plenty of jet lag, coupled with a natural inclination to not go to bed until 2 or 3 in the morning at the time, like an idiot. As was often my problem when flying, I sucked at fixing my jet lag, and would often be on the wrong sleep schedule for about a week. Instead of combating this with melatonin, Benadryl, hot milk, or literally any of the other thousands of methods to fall asleep, I decided listening to definitely not calm music would be the best way to lull myself to sleep. You know, like a fool. It was midnight, and like always I was wide awake. I lay in the guest bed facing the wall, headphones in and my eyes closed, but otherwise coherent and nowhere close to drifting off. The door to the room was closed, but had enough of a gap beneath it that the bright light of the hallway cast enough light to see where my suitcase was, on the floor and so on. We kept it on for anyone at night who had unexpected bathroom needs, so I was used to it being brighter than normal. While laying there, I felt a hard, bony finger jab my shoulder twice, like someone was trying to get my attention. Like a moron who was evidently way too comfortable in their own home. In the few seconds it took to roll over and face whoever needed me, not once did it occur to me that, had one of my family entered the room to shake me awake, the door would not only be open, but the room would be well lit, thanks to the hallway light being on instead of dim. As I turned, I saw a dark, humanoid silhouette standing over me. Tall and thin and disproportionate. The kind of deep dark that stood out even in a poorly lit room. It loomed over the bed, and it felt like it was staring at me. Naturally, I yelled incoherently because I had no idea who or what it was. Just that something had gotten into the room without me knowing, and I had zero idea about how much danger I was or was not in. I flung the blankets everywhere. I'm not sure if I was trying to hide or trying to get the figure tangled up instead, but it disappeared in my pinwheeling. I could barely sleep that night, too afraid of what it might do to me if it ever came back for me and I was unable to react the next time. Come the next morning, I told my family what had happened. My parents apologized and said,
"Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, someone lives in that room. They always have. We're just not sure who. We didn't think they'd bother you though."
I was less than pleased by this revelation, but thankfully spent the rest of my winter break with no further visitors in the middle of the night. I would go on to see the same figure a few more times throughout the duration of uni, sticking his head in the door once while I was cuddling on the couch with my now ex, occasionally rummaging through my ex's and her roommates' backpacks, and kneeling beside my bed with its hands resting on the mattress, like it was praying for me. I'll start off by saying, I have had a ton of experiences with the paranormal. These are just some of them. So as a teen, I was gifted a Ouija board for Christmas, and used it on several occasions. Sometimes I'd get something, but lots of the time it was nothing. So here are some of the tales. Me and my friend had heard of this notorious spot near where we lived, where people would drive out, lose service, and then their cars would shut off and not work again until they hit one of the other roads. We decided to go out there with my board and see if we could make any contact. Down this road there was a turn-off that was gated off, but there was no lock on the gate and it was wide open. So we drove down there, and it took us to a house foundation of a torn down stone house. My friend S, J, K, and my boyfriend at the time, D. Me and my friends J and K started with the Ouija, my boyfriend D and my friend S blazing in front while we girls were in the back of the truck. And we got contact right away. The entity we talked to seemed to be two children. The spelling was childlike and even playful. The talk seemed to be asking us about our clothes and stuff like that. Then it went silent, and these two twin entities were scared of another present entity, which was apparently their father, who, as ghosts go, was a right creep. The children kept on coming and going periodically, between when their father would leave. As we talked to them, they told us how he hurt Mummy, and when she was gone, he'd hurt them too. Now we didn't think much of this until we took a walk around the property and found a ditch full of household belongings. Kids' toys in duplicate, and kid-sized Led Zeppelin t-shirts side by side. This basically confirmed that this may be real. We had lost contact with all the entities at one point, and the father was pretty mad at us. I can't exactly remember why. We'd spent hours communicating with these entities in my friend's truck, and with that many people in a vehicle, the windows will fog up. This is when it starts getting really weird. On the inside of the fogged-up window was one child-sized handprint. Just one. And it was skeletal. My friend Jay, who had small hands, measured her hand against it, and it was far too small. Also, the window was not fogging up in that spot again. Shortly after we spotted this handprint, bang! Something hit the roof of S's truck so hard, the roof bowed in and then back out. You have never seen 5 people clown car out of a truck so fast. We searched on top of the truck, in the box on the ground. Nothing. We thought maybe a branch had broken off a tree we were under, or maybe a goose. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. When we checked the roof, there were 2 handprints, adult-sized. We're a bit freaked out at this point, so we all get back into the truck and my friend S tries to start it. It won't start, and we couldn't get reception on any phone. I was in the back, looking out the window, and I had noticed this strange mist coming over the grass towards us. I've never seen fog or mist move like this. As it got closer, it formed into a column, and it turned into a shape of a tribesman. It was wearing a type of headdress with feathers, a necklace, what looked like pants, and moccasins, and it was bare-chested. It took about 4 steps, and it was steps because the grass moved and I could distinctly make out every detail, and then disintegrated back into the mist, floating across the ground. It travelled in front of my friend's truck and moved off down a path through the trees. My friend S had seen it too and tried to start his truck again. It started. We then tried to follow him. We got close to the direction it had moved and the truck turned off again. My friend was annoyed at his truck because this never happens. We decided it's time to go and had to wait for his truck to start again. The truck turned off 3 more times before we could leave this area, and once more when we were on the road out of there. My friend was truck savvy, and he could not figure out what was wrong with it. His truck never did this, ever, again.
Okay, so I've been seeing shadow people since I was about 7. I would see them in the bedroom when I would go visit my grandmother, and I was terrified. I would hide my face under the covers until morning. I always just kind of thought the house was haunted, as they would only show up there. However, my mum got with someone very abusive when I was about 8 or 9, and I started seeing them outside of my house, just watching me when I went out to wait for the school bus. And that happened for a while. I just chalked it up to the fact I was on medicine at the time and couldn't sleep a lot. Then they stopped coming around until a few months ago. They only show up at my boyfriend's house, at the end of his hallway, and just stand there and block the way to the garage. I will note that someone died up in the garage before they bought the house, and once his mum and I swear we saw someone smushing their face against the glass window of the garage. There are 2 different ones I see. One that is just a bit taller than me and fully black. For context, I'm 5'2". And one that was fully just black mist. The bathroom door and the door leading to the garage are side by side. And one time I was walking out of the bathroom and he was right there as usual. The fully black one. He was so close I had to squeeze past him. I could actually feel friction on my skin when I did. I haven't seen that one in about 2 weeks, as the misty one took its place, but it was only once. I was walking out of the bathroom. He was in the same place and I thought nothing of it. I turned around to walk back to the room, and as I moved my arm back, I felt it grab my arm. I panicked and ran into the room. Also one time, when I was there alone just playing Sims, I heard what sounded like my boyfriend say my full first name. Like, he yelled it. Then I went out to check if he was there, and That's when I heard his mum yell my name. No one was home and I was left a bit spooked. Thank you for listening. This happened about 30 years ago to my grandfather, and given he's older than dirt, I'm typing it up for him as he tells it. This was around January of 1988. I went to work for a company called MUSC, Maritime and Underwater Security Consultants. US based, but most of her operations were over there in Indonesia. Basically, big freight companies wanted protection from local pirates. However, many simply weren't willing to pay the price and would choose to rely on the Navy. Which, son, let me tell you, after almost 16 years in the Navy, I learned a big thing. It's slow as hell. From South Korea to the Philippines, into Indonesia, and then onto Australia before making the journey home, the boys and I, 16 security personnel total, were stuck with a crew of about 50 Norwegians, and really, the captain was the only one who knew a lick of decent English. Anyway, we were passing through Makassar Strait at around 0130, dark as hell. The ocean was quiet. We'd advised the captain that sailing through this particular stretch of sea at night would increase our fee a shit ton. It was honestly the dumbest idea to ever have come out of that sucker's mouth. There had been 3 attacks on different merchant vessels the night prior. Nonetheless, in this man's infinite wisdom and wallet, he directed the crew to steam through. So us, educated Yankee folk, went to the upper decks and got ready for what was destined to be one hell of a night. Assault rifles, Kevlar, light machine guns, fire hoses, the whole caboon. Full 360 security too. Most of the boys I was with were prior Navy, with some, even if limited, combat experience. So we were pretty confident that we were able to handle some pirates armed with AKs. For the first hour and a half, everything was quiet. But that's the Q word that always lands people in trouble. Come up on the second hour, we received a distress call from another vessel about a mile away from us. The contract with this particular employer included terms that we had to render aid to other vessels in need for a fee adjustment. The captain directed our CO to send a few boys via RHIB over to this other vessel. So the course was adjusted. We got within 200 yards of this other ship, and the RHIB was being loaded up. Guess who got to go over? Myself and 5 others. To beat it all, this other freighter wasn't responding to hails or light signals. We were going in dark. We load up and cross the eerily dark and choppy ass sea. Shoot boarding grapples and climb up. Now son, you know how I feel about the next part, so I'm going to save some of the details. We cleared the bridge. Nobody was there. We cleared the crew quarters. Nobody was there. We cleared the lower decks. Nobody was there. Eventually, when we got to the engine compartments, we saw death. About 10 or 15 men had been cut up, shot, absolutely torn to bits, as if they'd been thrown into a blender. Limbs and feces laid about the room. It was absolutely disgusting. Turns out we'd stumbled across a kidnapping gone wrong. Some of the crew had fought back, so the local pirates dealt with them, took the remainder of the crew for ransom. Funny enough, our CO told us later that MUSC was the K&R company that retrieved them. So Grandpa has dementia, but this is one story that he's told consistently for the better part of his life. So, Mr. Pirate Folk, assuming you're all dead now, or at least I hope you are, let's not meet. As a kid, I used to live in an old home in the suburbs of Perth, Western Australia. The home was built in 1939 and I believe it was war housing for vets after the Second World War. It was laid out in 2 sections. My parents bought the house in 2000. The original home was at the front of the house, which was quite small, creaky wooden floorboards and high ceilings. There was only about 3 rooms. My room, my sister's room, and a playroom. This part of the house was where a lot of the activity was centered. A hallway connected the old house to what was originally the backyard, but had been renovated to add a large, modern wing onto the existing structure. My parents' room was in this wing. I lived there until I was about 12 years old, and my experience begins at around 5 or 6. I'd started to hate sleeping in my room, and being in that part of the house in general. Every time I was there, I felt uneasy, even during broad daylight, and I had no idea why. I was overwhelmed with panic every time I crossed the threshold into the old wing by myself. Activity was usually focused in the toy room, the biggest room in that part of the house. Small things like toys moving and going missing, turning on in the middle of the night when they were switched off hours prior. Stuff like that. The first experience was when I was around 5. I had a vivid night terror of a dirt-covered black glove reaching out from under my pillow and attempting to grab me. When I told my parents, they seemed unbothered, although now I know this wasn't the case. This comes into play later. When I was around 7, I remember a Barbie keyboard my sister had turning on and playing some sort of tune late at night. My sister woke me up as any kid would, and we both went and woke up our parents. When they heard what was happening, they were visibly on edge, as this was not at all the first experience they had with that room. After some apprehension, my dad went in and turned the keyboard off. The ceiling light wouldn't turn on. It worked in the morning though. A separate occasion involving toys happened in my room. I was around 8 years old and I had a 2008 Mummy's Gold Matchbox toy set. If anyone is unfamiliar with it, it's a battery-powered track which, once a Matchbox car runs over a button or the button is pushed, activates a mummy's eyes to glow and a voice line,
"I've got you now,"
to play in that typical 2000s scratchy audio. I was having trouble sleeping late one night. I was wide awake, so it wasn't some half-asleep hallucination. The
"I've got you now"
broke the silence as I jolted to look at the track. Its arms were moving up and down repeatedly, a functionality the toy did not have. Its arms were only meant to move up and down once. After a few seconds it stopped. I had been playing with it earlier and remember switching it off. I didn't sleep well that night. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room after this, and I can recall multiple occasions in which a clock would fall off the wall. No matter where it was placed or what we used to hang it up, it fell off every time. The activity was fairly quiet for the remaining couple of years we lived there. Basic spirit stuff like bangs, scratching noises, a cold breeze when there are no windows or doors open, dogs barking at doorways and corners when there's nothing there. We moved out in 2013. It's only years later that my parents told me about their experiences. They are now divorced and rarely agree on things, but this is one of them. The toy room used to be my sister's room when she was a baby, and the usual toy room stuff applies. Baby monitors, recording sounds of a lullaby player which has no batteries in it, or was put away in a closet only to be mysteriously attached to the crib again before being found halfway across the room in the morning. But by far the most disturbing account is that of a dark figure. Both my parents experienced waking up in the dead of night only to see a tall, dark figure around 6 feet tall. wearing a trench coat and standing over the other person as they sleep. The figure was always gone after a blink, and they each only saw it once, years apart. But it makes them uneasy just talking about it. Though it's not directly a first-hand experience, it helps corroborate my experiences. The part that terrifies me is their recount of its gloves. Both of them recalled it wearing black, dirty gloves, just like the ones I'd seen in my night terror as a child. That's pretty much it. Anybody have any idea what kind of spirit this could be? I don't doubt somebody died in the house, given its age, but I don't know how to categorize it. Thanks for listening.
Background story. I used to live in Moab, Utah with my mum, her boyfriend and the boyfriend's brother, at a mobile home park. She worked as the mobile home park manager and pretty much took bills for people for rent, sign up new people to move in, help with issues around the park, etc. So she knew everyone's name there because it wasn't that big of a complex. So fast forward to us living there for a while. It was around 2 or 3 p.m. and I'm sitting on the couch in the living room, just chilling on my phone, waiting for my mum to get home because it was a boring day that evening. As I'm sitting there, I hear clear as day my mum yell my name. I heard her yell in distress, "Tiff?" Now some may think that someone else was named Tiffany in that park, but since my mum worked as the manager, she knew there was no one else in the park named Tiffany. And she is the only person that calls me Tiff because I prefer to go by Tiffany. So I'm sitting there thinking, what does she want? I figured she would yell my name again if she really needed me. Then a few seconds later, I heard her scream, "Tiff!" This time she sounded more annoyed that I didn't answer her the first time. I sat there and thought to myself, her boyfriend's brother is outside on the porch smoking at the time. If she needs me to go out there, he would come inside and tell me that she needs me. So again, I stayed quite prepared to leave if I heard her again. And sure enough, she yelled Tiff again. She let that yell kind of drag on. So I knew she wanted me for something, and I thought she needed help. So I got up and was about to walk out the door when the brother came inside, and I asked him if my mum was calling me. And he just kind of stared for a second and said, "No," like I was crazy or something. I called my mum to ask if she was calling my name, and she said, "No, I'm at the store right now." I got off the phone and thought to myself, why the heck did I hear my mum screaming my name? Not just once, but 3 times, clear as day. When she yelled my name those 3 times, it sounded urgent, but not urgent enough for me to get up and run towards her. To this day, I think it was a mimic, because I'm the only one that heard her when the brother was outside and could have heard it much better than me. Good thing I didn't leave the first time and went off searching for her on my own.
This is a very long story, and I'm not the best at writing things out, but I'll try. I live in Georgia, the state, in a rural town not far from a major city. There's a set of woods that's behind our house, and it divides 2 neighborhoods, and it's about a mile wide, if that. Strange occurrences have always surrounded these woods. Small things like random trash, tarps, etc. I should mention it's more swampy marsh than woods, so it makes camping in there impossible. One night, I was taking our dog out. He stays in the back half of the house due to him not liking the other dogs. I took him out the side door and walked around the house to the fence. For some reason, when we left the house, he was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go out. Very unusual for a dog who's quick to snatch someone's soul if prompted. Not thinking about it, we pushed onwards. After he tinkled, we walked back. This is when I noticed it, or rather heard it. Crunching of leaves. At first, I thought it was one of our dozen cats on the property, until I realized it was matching my steps. If I walked, you could hear it walking. If I stopped, it stopped. There's a small clearing between the woods where one of our sheds is. That's when we saw it. My dog was the first to see something, and then I saw some, creature? It was taller than the shed, so maybe a good 8 feet tall, and it darted across the clearing at a crazy fast speed. My dog, who again isn't scared of anything, bolts so fast, I dropped his leash and he ran to the door whining. I was quickly behind him. Once we were inside, I quickly bolted the door and ran to tell my girlfriend what happened. She immediately wanted to investigate, saying it's probably a woodland creature. Armed with 2 flashlights, we went out the front door. As we walked towards the wood line, we could hear something moving around. It sounded maybe 200 yards away. As we scanned with our flashlights, we saw nothing, but kept hearing it. Then we heard it get closer and closer, until it was maybe 20 feet away. Still nothing. My girlfriend, now scared, heads for the house. I decide to check with the neighbors to see if maybe one of their many dogs got out. When I arrived at his house, my neighbor, who we'll call Dave, explained that all his dogs were accounted for. Curious, he came to investigate. This is when I noticed that whatever this thing was followed me along the wood line to Dave's house, and was now behind Dave's house. Gun in hand, we went to his backyard, scanning for something. We could hear it rustling or maybe running. About 100 yards away in thick, swampy woods. Way too thick for a person to walk in, let alone run in. Then it stopped. It was dead silent. Scanning and on edge, we hear and see nothing. And then bam! All of a sudden, it was 5 feet in front of us, sprinting at me. It slammed the fence so hard, it rocked it back and forth. Dave shot randomly at, nothing. We never saw it, never heard it get close to us. Again, as I mentioned, the woods are thick. Too thick to run in, so what was it that teleported silently in front of us and slammed the gate? Spooked, we were about to run. Then we heard it. It was human in nature, but not English. It sounded alien-like, not a known language. Dave, a hunter for the last 40 years, still to this day can't explain what it was. Anyway, after we heard that, we bolted. He covered me and I ran to my house. Not 10 minutes later, we both hear a loud explosion coming from the woods. It shook our houses and flickered our power. I ran outside to see what it was, and of course, there was nothing. But when Dave came out and confirmed, he felt the same thing. We were both once again terrified. Moments later, a few strangers from the neighborhood came driving down to our cul-de-sac, and they all agreed. The blast sound they heard came from behind our house. 911 was called and 2 police officers interviewed us separately. Our stories matched. The responding officers refused to go anywhere near those woods. They took the report and left. To this day, we're still not sure what that encounter was. Also, Dave doesn't go outside at night anymore. It spooked him that bad. The next day, earlier in the morning, my mother-in-law, a police officer for a town 40 minutes away, installed 2 motion-activated trail cams along the wood's edge. They were brand new. Keep that detail in mind. Thinking maybe we'd see something, we waited for nightfall. Later that evening, we went outside to feed our outdoor cats. That's when we heard it again, rustling. This time, not taking any chances, I ran inside and told everyone what I heard. They all piled by the back door and urged me to go out there and look. Reluctantly, I agreed. I took my flashlight and walked to the edge of the woods. Knowing there was a trail cam covering this area, I figured if it got me, it would be on camera and my sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. As I got to the wood's edge, I could hear it still rustling. I'm shaking at this point because I could tell it was maybe less than 15 yards in front of me. Everyone at the door was watching me, and I could hear this thing. Then it got quiet. For a moment, it was gone, or so I thought. Just as I'm scanning with my flashlight, trying desperately to see a normal woodland creature, so I can laugh this whole thing away. Boom! Something fell out of a tree and hit the ground so hard it shook the soil beneath my feet. It was so close that I was sure it was going to lunge out the brush and snag me. I dropped my flashlight and ran 100 yards back to the house in what felt like 2 seconds. I screamed, "Get in the house!" as everyone was already scampering into the house. They heard and felt the thud too. Our neighbour Dave called my mother-in-law to ask what that loud crash was. For him to have heard it from well over 700 yards away is insane to me. Once the adrenaline died down, we realized that this happened right next to the trail cam. Problem solved. We got evidence of this thing. The next morning, we checked the SD cards on the trail cams. They have pictures up until 11:47 p.m. The rest is corrupted. They were both brand new trail cams and SD cards. We reset everything and set them back up, and to this day, we've still never encountered the creature again, nor caught anything on the camera. I want to really let everyone know that we had no idea what this boy looked like. I've been asked before, if you didn't even see him, how did you know? The best way I can explain is that it's like closing your eyes and someone suddenly coming into the room you were in. You just sense it. Anyway, I'll tell you 3 other instances with this boy, and I'll post a final third one about the times he really upset us. So we kept playing with the farm boy. Dolls, board games, talked about school, and left him our toys to play with when we left the house. It was a blast, cause we had another playmate. Now, we had this neighbour, who was a house full of boys ranging in age from 17 to 10. The family only had one little girl about our age, maybe my little sister's age, and our parents thought it would be nice for us to socialise, considering me and my little sister weren't really the social types, and the other little girl had her home full of boys. It was decided she would come over to our home, and we were a little awkward at first. We showed her our room, toys, backyard, and soon ended up watching VHS tapes of our Disney movies. We set up the little TV right next to our room, so we were out of the way, and close to our room to take out any toys we wanted. I remember looking at our room door, noticing it was slightly ajar, and the little girl saying she wanted to play with the white horse we had. The door suddenly slammed shut, and I took that as Farm Boy didn't want her to play. I turned to her and told her that I think we should just stick with the movies. My memory gets a little fuzzy at this point, but I remember feeling upset because the little girl had said something to us. I wanted her to leave. She was sitting on my right, and I remember just staring at her, tears welling, and I remember the face she made. She had seen something behind me. Her eyes and mouth got wide, and she started bawling. I turned around and the bedroom door was now wide open. Me and little sister were a little surprised, but my mum had heard her and called her mother. She never played with us at our house again. I'm still trying to make myself believe it was just a nightmare. I wish it was a nightmare. I mentioned playing the Ouija board 3 times. I wish I never did play it. Even now I don't know what the hell I was thinking, or if I even was at all. I think I was bored or whatever, maybe desperate to talk with a loved one. They were played at night. The first time I played, I only broke one rule. I was playing alone. I was playing on the floor of my small room. Nothing happened, so I ended the game properly, saying goodbye. The second time I still played alone. The pointer moved around, but really slow and in no direction at all. Just a circle. See, I didn't think much of this. Maybe it needed time to reply. Never landed on a letter or a number. It moved from a circle to trying to get off the board. I ended the game like last time. The third time, I asked what its name was, and it spelt out Z-O-Z-O. I tried keeping calm and ended the game. I heard of Z-O-Z-O. I knew I messed up horribly. When I tried going to sleep at about 2 in the morning, something scratched my foot. Instantly I couldn't move. I felt like I was being held down. My door was cracked open, but nothing was there. Something was definitely there. No human can get under my bed without shuffling around trash. Yes, I'm not exactly the neatest, but something has to be under my bed because I fear a human or thing crawling on all fours. When I looked at the cracked open door and started overthinking every possibility that could happen, except for horrendous murder, in this weird second-person view, I vividly see the most twisted murder I can't bring myself to repeat. I'll just say decapitation and a deep slash over the throat in the most violent way possible. There was a shadow thing crouching down beside my parents' bed. Whatever it was, I'm banging on my neighbor's door, crying, screaming and shaking really hard. But I'm still in my bed staring at the cracked open door, quietly crying. Then in that weird view, I'm seeing everything again until morning. That hasn't happened again, but I threw the board out and just believed it was a loop dream. Until I see the same shadow thing walking casually from the hallway to the kitchen about a week ago. I'm not the only person seeing that thing. Our 3 cats see it too. One minute, they'll be playing and having fun. Then they suddenly stop and stare at whatever got their attention. The next thing, they dig their claws into the rug as they run after whatever they'd seen. They end up in my room I stupidly played that game in. I'm a night owl and I'm always tense at home. My muscles often hurt because of how I'd tensed them so often. My work was supposed to be a little bit of normalcy. It did work for a while, until the encounters with them happened. We are going to be a little understaffed for a while. Some may not get a 30-minute break. It's sort of falling apart. Since that happened, my door has stayed shut. That board is at the dump now, and honestly, I'm being stared at a bit more often from the hall. The shadow that peeks around corners seems to be more curious. That's different from the shadow I've seen in my parents' room. The shadow in my parents' room was bigger, potentially taller than the curious one. It sticks around a little longer, and I can get a bit more of a look at it than a glimpse. I hope I never experience whatever that was, a nightmare. Whatever that view shift was about. Never playing that board again. Maybe it was a nightmare and I didn't know I fell asleep. Maybe I was half asleep. I was trying to sleep, but I just laid in bed, not feeling tired yet. I don't mind not being believed, being criticized. School did that more often than teaching. But this is killing me, because I was awake when this happened. The story you're about to hear is real. I finally decided to go public with my experiences after nearly 3 decades, with just a few close family members and friends knowing. This was only my first occurrence with shadow people growing up. I had many more, mostly in my preteens to teens. Most of the paranormal experiences occurred within a range of 15 or so years, give or take. This story begins with my first paranormal experience of shadow people. My parents met in the late 80s, and they were both serving members of the military. Shortly after they met, both my parents were assigned to an Air Force base in Ontario. I was born in there, and my brother followed shortly afterwards. Roughly a year after my brother was born, we were transferred to the province of Quebec. We were located in a highly francophone region of Quebec, where my father had been posted to an army base. My parents decided to buy a house in a neighboring town. It wasn't a luxury home, but I enjoyed my time there as a kid. We had a large backyard, which I spent a lot of time in. The history of the house is unknown to my family. From the looks of it, the house didn't appear haunted. It wasn't bent out of shape. It was just a 1970 to 80s cookie-cutter house in an ordinary middle-class neighborhood. I suppose this might be one of many visions of what a basic family home would look like in North America. In this house, everything started. We were what I thought was an average family, but happy and in good health. Nobody had any serious issues. The family dynamic was awesome, and my dad was incredibly creative and fun. For the most part, we were good children. We did well in our early school years, and we weren't too spoiled, especially because we couldn't afford to be. But my mother did everything she could to pamper me and my brother. She wanted a good life for us. She would save her money to ensure that we always had new clothes and shoes for school. She also always taught us good manners, to treat all people with respect and to not judge others. Despite their eventual separation, they remained to be amazing parents. They always did their best to offer us a good life. When we moved to this town, my mother sacrificed her service to follow my father's. I believe it was a fluke that they were previously posted to the same base, because in the 1980s, career managers were not as accommodating to service couples as they are now in Canada. She decided to use this opportunity to raise her children and to look after the home until we were old enough to look after ourselves. Once you entered the front door of the house, there was a small square area for removing your boots and hanging your keys. There were 2 sets of stairs directly in front of you, one to the ground floor and one to the basement. Below and directly to the left, there was a bathroom, and inside the bathroom on the left side, there was a small storage space. The space was large enough to kneel down and walk into, so my dad used the space to develop film, since it was a dark and secluded room. While the restroom was on the left, my room was on the right, which was beside my parents' room. I had a small window in my bedroom on the left side that had a partial view of our large, fenced-in backyard. I couldn't see anything though, since the window was located high enough on the wall, and I was almost at the basement level. Plus, I was just a little guy. I vividly recall many details. My parents purchased my first bed for me when we moved into that house. It was lifted up onto a metal frame and painted bright red, like a maraschino cherry. There was also a railing that my parents later took off when I became older. Most nights, we probably went to bed between 7 and 8 p.m. We were familiar with the routine and we followed it. We had a very military style of discipline in our home. Not only were my parents in the military, but so were the previous generations in my family, and that culture carried on. We weren't perfect kids, but I like to think we were well-behaved kids. One night, I awoke in my cherry red bed. I knew it was late because it was dark outside from my window, but not so late that my parents were asleep, because I could hear them talking upstairs with the TV on. I struggled to fall asleep, so I lay down on my bed, looking around a room like any curious child. I was getting uncomfortable, so I turned over to my left side, which would have been facing the door to my bedroom. It was dark enough in the room, but I was in my room long enough for my eyes to be well adapted to the darkness at this stage. The only light I had from my room was the gentle light of a faint porch light, and any ambient light from the moon. I looked around the room, and then I began to draw my attention to my bedroom door. It had passively piqued my interest because I noticed that the area located directly in front of my closed bedroom door was unusually dark. I remember being able to look at the surrounding walls, but not that specific area for some reason. I kept watching the black mass and looked away a few times, still looking around the room. I looked back at the door, and in the confusion I saw an opaque black figure in the outline of a person standing right there. It was probably about 8 feet away or so, give or take. I wasn't initially scared, and instead I think I kind of giggled, thinking it looked like a person, and that some object in my room was obviously creating a very telling shadow of a humanoid. I kept looking into the shadows, but I started to realize that something seemed strange. The shadow itself was not on the wall. It was off the wall, in the room, standing like a person and opaque black in color. No light seemed to come through. It was not transparent. It was not translucent. It was a deep black hole black. I was still confused and didn't put too much thought into it, so I kept gazing. In one moment I was relaxed and intrigued as to what was causing this image in front of me, but in the next, I was stuck with paralyzing fear as I started to see the figure move towards me. It wasn't walking like a human or something I even recognized on the planet at that moment in my life. There were almost no features. There was no face, but I could clearly discern the shape of the body, arms, legs, and so on. It resembled a man. When the shadow approached me, it didn't do so by walking. There were no fluid human-like limbs moving around in a human-like or even earth-like fashion. This shadow would vanish, then reappear a step or two closer in a moment, as fast as a shutter can trigger on a camera. I didn't stop looking. I could not shout. I trembled. I cried. And I had my blankets set against my eyes. But I kept watching, as if it was a film. It continued to move towards me, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, until it stood right over me by my nightstand. I was petrified at that moment. With speed, I threw the blankets over my head and buried my face as deeply into the pillows and blankets as I could without suffocating. It never left. My eyes were closed, but it made no difference. 3 of these shadows were penetrating their way into my mind, even though my eyes were sealed shut. These shadows were morphing vividly into horrifying faces, shapes, and grotesque images, all with the purpose of causing overwhelming fear. I could see them in my head. They were clear as day. It was almost like they were telling me, "You can't hide from us." I felt them taking great pleasure in my fear. It was very dark and sinister, and I couldn't get these figures to leave. I felt trapped, like a deer being surrounded by wolves. I could no longer bear it, as I knew I had no place to hide. Somehow, I had the courage to dash out of my room and scream for my parents. I remember running up the stairs to my living room, tripping on the way as I shouted, "Mommy! Daddy! I have a man in my bedroom!" I was emotionally distraught, weeping, trembling, and hyperventilating. My mother did what I think most mums would do, and tried to reassure their kid that it was just a dream, and to go back to sleep. I insisted on the fact that there was a man in my room. My parents took me back to bed, turned on the light, and said a prayer while leaving a holy crucifix under my pillow. It is the only case I can recall of this specific town, but it wasn't my last experience. They came back at times later in my life, from the age of 9 to 18, and at a much higher intensity. In 2008, I was driving from New Orleans, Louisiana, to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 22 female, and my year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back, a fancy flip phone, and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around that time, but I didn't have one. Cell phone service was also much spottier, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul was really low on gas. Just when I'm starting to freak out and seriously run out of gas, I see a small town coming up. I pull into this town and it is tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there were only about 6 streets in the whole place. I go gas up and am ready to get back on the road, except I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway. I circle the town about 4 times and start getting so frustrated because this is such a tiny town. How can I not find my way out? I can literally see the highway, but I can't get to it. I return to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I got gas, I paid at the pump and never went in. When I enter for directions, there's a skinny, nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in front of his eyes that looks like it could use a good wash. He's not particularly creepy, but a little rude. He never really met my eyes. He was looking down at a magazine. He gives me directions that don't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, I'm dumbfounded. Then I point out that I didn't drive that far to get from the highway into town. Why so far to get back to the highway? I can literally see it from the town. He is so casual, almost like I'm just an annoyance, and can follow his directions or not. Why should he care? He gives me some explanation about the road curving around that doesn't really make sense. He still doesn't look at me. Just whatever. I gave you your directions, and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing, seemingly for no reason. I get into the truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I had the most terrible feeling that, no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions. I didn't know what, but I knew right then and there that there was no way I was going to follow his directions. Yet, this was the only store in this little town, and short of knocking on doors, there was no one else to ask for directions. I decided I didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something dropped out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my own way out, even if it took all damn night. Then, a big red beater of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulls up and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel and work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly yet warily. Looking into his eyes, I saw a kind human being, or at least I was hoping I did. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back. He looked concerned, as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curve turnoff right at the end of a small concrete tunnel I had passed several times. He said it often confused travelers because it was so hard to see. They needed to put up signs, etc. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how many miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me a funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. You can see the highway right from here." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "What happens if I drive?" And I gave him the directions the man in the store had given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was quiet for a few minutes, and then asked what the attendant looked like, and if I had a map of the state. Nope, just my MapQuest, which wasn't helpful in this situation. He goes to his truck and grabs a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route I described. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led away from town, away from the interstate, and led to, seemingly, the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the desert. I asked him what was out there, and he told me that it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things townspeople had to say about them. And the erstwhile clerk was part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me that I was smart to listen to my instincts, and he told me to be careful traveling out there. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul, or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully, I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I will always remember you with tons of love. Sorry I didn't ask your name. You're forever Texas to me now. So I thought I'd just share some things we've experienced in our rental that were a little too eerie to pass off as coincidence. I'm not a great storyteller, so I'll write them in a list form. These have all happened over the last 18 months. The place is an apartment on the second floor in Sydney, Australia. 1. Every night I clean the kitchen after dinner. Nothing is left out or in the sink. Bench tops are empty. I have a work tool, a 150mm steel ruler I lost maybe 3 months prior. I woke up one morning to make coffee before work, flicked the light on, and my ruler was in the sink. I hadn't seen it in months, and it definitely was not in there the night prior. 2. My wife and I had just finished taking a shower, and we were drying off in the bathroom. We heard the click of the electric kettle. I asked if she'd flicked it on before we jumped in, and she said no, and asked if I had. I walked out to inspect, and the click we heard was the kettle turning on, not off. 3. My wife had hung photos on the walls around the house. I was working interstate one night when she called me terrified, because the 3 in our bedroom had come off the wall and crashed down at the same time. The hooks were still on the wall. 4. This one really creeped me out. I woke up at 5 AM for work one morning and saw a light flickering from our lounge room. I walked out and saw a custom candle we had made for our wedding gifts was lit and flickering away. And it was 100% not lit the night before, as it was in a photo I had uploaded to my Instagram. My wife also swears she sees something, out of the corner of her eye at least weekly. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, I'm not too worried if it is something paranormal. It hasn't seemed destructive, except for maybe trying to burn the place down. Thanks for listening. Edit. I just remembered something else that happens maybe monthly. We'll often find plugs pulled from sockets that neither of us have touched. I was 15 and chatting on Gmail with my boyfriend at the time, past midnight. I believe it was 2 or 3 a.m. Whether or not I had the door slightly opened or shut, I do not remember. I heard my doorknob rattling, and I'm like, oh, I'm in trouble, because I wasn't supposed to stay up that late. I heard my mum whisper my name. She sounded annoyed. I turned around, and it wasn't my mum. It was this weird misty white figure that kinda looked like the painting, The Scream. Freaked out, I tell my boyfriend what happened, turned back around, and it was gone. I went to my parents' bedroom, and they were both asleep. I woke up my mum to tell her what happened, and she told me if I see it again, to pray and ask what it wants. I didn't see it again until a few weeks later, or a month, I'm not sure, in the daylight. Nothing happened though. I was only walking down the hallway, and I looked at the restroom, which was slightly opened, and I saw the same figure peeking at me.
So let's all be honest here. Everyone knows that the Rake is nothing more than a creepypasta. However, you cannot deny that people around the world are seeing and having legitimate experiences with this creature, or rather one that resembles the being in the stories, myself included. I've grown up with a relatively open mind in regards to strange phenomenon, and things that aren't generally accepted by mainstream science or society, but always approach things with appropriate skepticism. I've spent a very large majority of my life in the woods, hunting, fishing and mountain climbing, miles deep in the backcountry, and so within all of that time, I've observed many different animals, plants and sometimes things I just simply cannot explain. I've gone camping and trekking solo many times in my life. It was liberating to just pack whatever you needed to survive and go miles deep into the backcountry, where animals aren't even afraid of you, simply because they aren't familiar with humans. It felt so special to be the only one immersed in that environment, but not anymore. Now, hidden behind all of the natural beauty is underlying anxiety, fear, and legitimate danger. An environment that once felt so comforting and therapeutic turned into one that drove me absolutely mad with questions and uncertainties, and is now one I will not enter alone, for I know what is possible and what is truly roaming around the forests of North America. It was 2016, in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, that I saw a creature that forever changed my life and the way I perceive the world we live in. The first time I had ever heard of the creature dubbed the Rake was during a conversation with a friend who had lived in the area for years and had encountered this creature on multiple occasions in very close proximity to his house. I remember him asking me if I had ever saw anything strange in the large plot of woods across the street from his house, which, at the time, I had not. However, long before it was brought up, I always had a deep feeling in my chest about this plot of woods. I don't know what it was. I just knew that it carried a very heavy, dark energy that was strong enough to encourage you to stay out. My friend took out their phone and showed me the picture of the Rake that comes up with any Google search. A very generic picture. I laughed it off as he warned me about the creature because I genuinely thought he was just growing marijuana or something in the woods, and didn't want me to find out. I couldn't have been any more wrong. Months had passed with little more than strange noises at night and the sound of some cats being carried off into the dark, until the day that changed my life happened. It was midnight. A rainstorm had just dumped a bunch of rain, and me and a co-worker at the time had just clocked out and were heading to the friend's house who had warned me originally about the creature. His house is on a long straight road with a dead end. Very few houses on one side, woods on the other. As we are heading down the road with high beams on, my co-worker slams on the brakes and starts freaking out, saying that he just saw the creature kneeling down on the shoulder of the road. Instantly, without thought, I jumped out of the car and immediately heard running and crashing through the woods in a parallel line to the road. Thankfully, due to the hard braking, the car shifted slightly so that the high beams were pointed into the woods. And that's when I saw it. That's when my life changed. My beliefs shattered and my reality turned upside down. A 6-foot-tall naked creature with greyish-white skin and long arms ran through the section of the woods, fully illuminated by the headlights, giving me at least 15 seconds of uninterrupted visual contact with the creature, firmly imprinting it into my head. It ran just like a human being, however, it was incredibly fast and jumping over any obstacle in the way, until it reached the point where the headlights no longer illuminated the woods. It then pretended to jump and run deeper into the woods. However, it actually turned and headed back to the road, where I lost sight of it in the dark part of the woods for about 30 seconds. As I was standing in the middle of the road, absolutely dumbfounded with my jaw on the floor, trying to comprehend the severity of the situation, it then crawled out from the woods and crossed the road on all fours, about 60 yards away from me, and disappeared into the woods on the other side. I've been tormented by the creature since. It makes me confused, sad, curious. I can't get the image out of my head. I can't forget the feelings this creature gave me while I lived there, playing and toying with my head in waking life, and in my dreams. I don't go into the backcountry alone anymore. I can't enjoy the solitude without anxiety ruining it. I can't be free. This creature exists, and so do others that we just can't understand. And it's important that people realize this so they can enjoy nature, while also being safe. I'm not sure how this post will be taken, and I'm not really sure why I feel like now was the time to come out about my story. But it's eating me alive. It's given me crippling anxiety, and I have to do something to try and get this off my chest. Believe me or don't, that doesn't matter to me. I just want people to be safe, and I want my freedom back. And if coming out about this will help, then I'll do anything. The world truly isn't all that it seems. I live in Germany. The incident I'm about to report happened a few years ago. I was driving in my car on a Wednesday night, alone. I was just visiting a friend of mine and returned home. It was long into the night, around 4 a.m. Since he lives in a remote area, I had to drive through a very remote region to get home. It was a rainy night. I was driving around 80 kilometers per hour with my high beams on, around 50 miles per hour for my American friends. Nobody was with me, neither in the car or in the streets. Then I saw it. In the middle of nowhere, in a dark, rainy forest, there was a white human-shaped figure standing beside the road. I was instantly looking for a wrecked car or any kind of transportation, but there was none. I slowed down and headed into the middle of the street to have more clearance between me and the person I saw. As I went in closer,
I could see this is going to be spooky because the white man was standing in plain rain. No motion, just standing there. I couldn't even figure out where he was looking at because he was entirely white and somehow glowed. There was no way to differentiate the clothes from the face. It was just a completely white human-like figure standing in the forest. I knew this route and I was back at the exact same spot afterwards. There was nothing that could be interpreted as a person at night. I never saw that man again. In retrospect, I am very angry about myself. I should have stopped, but I just didn't. Tell me your thoughts about this incident. Have you ever heard of something like this? Is this a common paranormal sighting? I have a few stories that I can't explain, but this is the one I feel the need to share, because it happens to align with a type of experience that so many people have reported throughout the years, arguably since ancient times. I've always been certain of what I saw, but when I first became aware of shadow people as a commonly reported phenomena, any doubt I had about the incident disappeared. So many people have tried to tell me that what I experienced was just a dream, or simply brushed it off with that look that says, this guy is either nuts or lying. And honestly, it's time that people start taking victims of paranormal visitation at their word. In an age where we're starting to wake up to a fact that victims of all forms of abuse deserve a voice and representation, it's sad to see so many people disregarded as mentally ill or confused, just because their experience lacks an accredited scientific explanation. My experience was not as extreme as some that I've heard from others on various paranormal forums or podcasts, but it has affected my life in a number of ways. And to have the source of so many anxieties and frustrations in your life disregarded as a dream or a fiction leaves a person feeling very alone, unable to really explore their trauma because the subject is so taboo, and very few people are willing to take your account seriously and help you search for answers. This is my story, and I assure you I have nothing to gain by bringing you a false account. I just want to put my testimony out there so that other experiences can know that they are not alone, and they are probably not crazy. There are things in this life that do not yet have a scientific explanation, and humanity is not the only sentient intelligence that operates in this world. Beyond that, I really don't know a damn thing, but accepting that fact is the first step in beginning to fully understand the nature of this world, or any others that may exist. The first time I saw it, I was about 8, maybe as old as 10. I was living in a dingy little house in Clear Lake, Iowa, in what you'd consider to be the trashier part of the small tourist town. My room was at the end of a long hallway, on the right side of the hall, if you were looking towards it from the kitchen on the opposite end. Across the hall, the left side, was my toddler sister's room, and in the middle of the hall, on the left, was the door to my parents' room. One morning I got out of bed and started moving towards the kitchen. When I was just about at my parents' door, looking toward the kitchen, the figure appeared. It sort of leaned into the hall from the living room, which was adjacent to the kitchen. It was a tall black figure, black as in pitch black, but sort of smoky and hazy, like it was just a bunch of compressed black smoke, molded into a human form. Everyone seemed tall to me as a kid, but this thing certainly seemed taller than my parents, who are 5'5" and about 5'6" respectively. The only distinguishable feature on the being were 2 glowing red eyes, just like circular LEDs on its face. They didn't really seem to be the size and shape that a human eye really is, but truly round and glowing brightly. This detail I'm sort of fuzzy on, but that's what I recall. From the moment it leaned into view, the thing was just watching me, and when I saw it, I stopped and watched it back. I wasn't exactly scared, but had the distinct impression that this was all it was there to do, to watch. I knew this wasn't normal. I knew this wasn't something that I should be seeing in the real world. And I was uncomfortable, but all in all, the thing was non-threatening and didn't make any advancements on me. It just stood there for a minute or two, and then leaned back, out into the living room. I didn't follow it to see if it really disappeared. I just went back to my room until my parents woke up. I never woke up from this experience. My day progressed seamlessly into a normal day. I knew this was not a dream because I was very familiar with my dreams. I had constant night terrors in this house, but I'll get into that later on. The point being, the kinds of dreams I had were more distinctly bizarre and surreal than this experience, and I always woke up with an understanding that what I had experienced that night was just a dream. This was not the case that morning. If I was dreaming that morning, then I'm still dreaming, because I never woke up from that. The second experience was just as brief, but a bit more menacing. I can't say how much time passed between the two events, but this incident was dead on in the middle of the day, in full daylight with other people in the house going about their daily business. My mother was in the living room, and I had just walked into the kitchen and towards the hall. I was now standing approximately where the figure had been on the first occasion, looking down toward my room and my sister's. Suddenly, the figure appeared. This is where it gets really bizarre because the thing actually crept out of my room. I mean, this thing was literally creeping, like some old school Scooby-Doo villain, walking on tiptoes with his arms raised and hands bent toward the floor. If you get what I'm illustrating here, you should probably laugh because it was just as goofy as it sounds. It crept from my room into my sister's, which is what really freaked me out about this event. The whole event was over in just a few seconds. Moving in this bizarre manner, it had its head turned towards me the whole time. From the moment it crossed the threshold of my door, its eyes were already on me, as if to say,
I'm here straight creeping around your house and there's nothing you can do about it. No one's gonna believe you.
I had already told my mum about the first sighting, and of course, she'd dismissed it as a dream or as an overactive imagination. So I didn't bring it up, but I was really scared that it had some sinister intentions with my sister. I do remember her having some nightmares around this time, which I heard from my room, her crying to my mum about how the creature from the Black Lagoon, a movie we watched often in our household, was standing in the corner of her room. I asked her about this years later, but she doesn't remember any details of that. So, that's my story. If you've had a similar experience with a shadow person, or experienced something that should not be possible, just know that you are not alone. My family and I were driving from Ohio to Wyoming one holiday season to visit family about 10 years ago. Due to storms farther north, we traveled straight west instead of northwest at first, and split the trip at Omaha, staying the night before heading up through Nebraska into South Dakota. Once we were far enough north, we turned west onto I-90. At that point, it had been over an hour since we saw anywhere that might have a public restroom, and we were on state routes, so no rest areas. Those of you who have traveled with a young kid know that's close to their bladder and boredom's limit, and our daughter was begging to stop somewhere to pee. South Dakota was similarly deserted, and even worse as we headed west. Finally, we reached a desperately needed rest stop, as my, at the time, 5-year-old and I both needed to pee by then. Just as we pulled in, the truck that had been following us for a while pulled in too. I didn't think too much of that at first, until I started to open my door. My head was turned to the right, where the truck was parked a couple of spots over.
My eyes met the driver's, and I just shivered. He was a skinny white guy, straggly grey-brown beard and dark eyes. I could see that he was wearing a dingy, dirty blue plaid shirt. He got out of his 90s brown and cream truck and started rummaging in the bed. I told my husband I didn't want to go into the rest stop alone because of the guy and the weird feeling I got from him. He thought I was being a little silly but agreed to come with us. At that point, the next stop was Wall, South Dakota, about 100 miles away according to the huge billboards we'd passed advertising it. He figured he'd better empty his bladder, even though he didn't particularly feel the need. I grabbed my daughter and we headed inside, followed by the guy who'd finished rummaging at his truck but wasn't carrying anything when I glanced back. My daughter and I did our business in the women's restroom and headed back out to the lobby. As I expected, my husband was already out there, since he didn't have a small human to chaperone. The old guy was also in the tiny lobby area. He was just standing there staring at my husband. My husband rushed us back to our car. As we were buckling in, he locked the doors. Then he told me that the guy hadn't even gone into the restroom and was just standing in the lobby the whole time. He agreed with me that we might have just had a close call, and he was glad it hadn't just been me and our daughter there. However, that's not the end of the story. Remember how I mentioned Wall and that it was 100 miles away? Well, that was 100 miles of pretty empty landscape, but a decent number of turn-offs from the interstate. We didn't see the truck following us and thought the whole episode was behind us. Except when we stopped in Wall to grab lunch and some road snacks, plus look around this homey but fun little tourist trap in the middle of nowhere. We saw the guy in the store not even 20 feet from us. Same face, beard, dirty plaid shirt. Thankfully, we'd already eaten, so since he was staring at us again, we quickly paid for our snacks and trinkets and got the heck out of there. Thankfully, we didn't see him again, but I was seriously creeped out until we reached our relatives in Wyoming safely with no other sight of that truck. I don't necessarily believe my experiences have anything to do with extraterrestrials, and I maintain a lot of skepticism. However, the human brain does what it does, and that means recognizing patterns wherever it can. I find consistencies with my story that line up with many phenomena associated with alien encounters. Firstly, let me give you some background information. I'm a 17-year-old living in Darwin, Australia. I frequently have sporadic episodes of insomnia. I've deduced this to overall stress and anxiety. Despite this, I can recall trouble sleeping derived from either nightmares or just general restlessness since I was a kid, so keep that in mind. My first encounter was on a camping trip with my grandmother to a dam reserve 3 hours from our town. During the holidays and weekends, families spent their time fishing, hiking and doing other recreational activities. But during the week, virtually no one was there, so sometimes my grandma would take my brother and me for little excursions. I was about 7 or 8 at the time, living in rural New South Wales. This time my brother didn't want to come, so it was just my grandma and me. The camping spot overlooked the water. Dead grey-silver trees lined the shore. I remember very little about the trip other than the experience. We were in our swags, or sleeping bags, looking at the sky. The lack of light pollution meant that the stars shone incredibly bright. My grandma was dozing off when I saw the first shooting star fly over the Southern Cross. I nudged to tell her. "That's cool," she said, closing her eyes again. I saw another but decided not to wake her. Then, another, and another.
I woke her. She stayed up long enough to see a whole meteor shower. She joked, saying she nearly missed it because she didn't believe me. After 10 minutes, the shooting stars stopped and she closed her eyes for the last time that night. I stayed awake. I was just pumped that I had seen something so cool. Then, after failing to count stars, I saw a little orb of light appear on the left of the Southern Cross, bright white with a blue lining around the edge, about a quarter of the size of a full moon, just sitting there. I had heard about UFOs from my granddad and older brother talking about them, from living in Alice Springs, but wasn't completely sure what one was at this point. Hell, I didn't even know that UFO was an acronym, or that they had any affiliation with aliens. A minute or two of hovering stationary, it sort of started to slide left further, then sped up and finally darted off, leaving a thin light trail akin to the shooting stars. Then, with a quiet crack, it disappeared. That was the first and only time I had seen a UFO. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now I find it fascinating. Whether it had any relation to extraterrestrials was beyond me, however. The second experience was a much closer encounter with something that happened between 3 and 5 years ago. I am something of a night owl. Back in my early high school days, I'd stay up until 2 in the morning, reading or watching movies or deciding that was a good time to do homework. I came out of my room to put a mug in the sink after I finished my tea. I used my phone's flashlight to see because I didn't want to wake my brother. The light was faint, but enough to see my reflection in the glass and notice a pair of orange lights. I looked behind me, thinking it was from a kitchen appliance or something, but there was no light. I turned back around, kinda shitting myself. The lights were closer and I could see a faint, pale silhouette against the dark garden. I was kind of frozen in fear. All I could do was stare at these two hypnotic eyes of whatever it was staring at me. It was almost like how an animal's eyes look under a flashlight, but like it had its own source. I was worried that any sudden moves would spook it or prompt some sudden movement from the creature. I was preparing myself to turn my back and run to my room, but was terrified it might chase me or come inside. Living in rural Australia, we don't really bother locking doors. No one breaks in. I felt we were staring at one another for the longest time, but it couldn't have been for more than a minute. A minute and a half tops. I counted to 3 and bolted to my room, jumped in bed and pulled the covers over my face. I remember this ringing in my ears from the adrenaline and shaking from fear. Quite frankly, I am surprised I didn't pee myself. I had to sleep with a light on that night. I regret not assessing how tall it was. All I can remember is a pale humanoid figure and those glowing eyes. A few months after this, I got up to open the curtains and louvres of my room to let the cool, dry season air in. I felt that shock again, seeing the same pair of orange eyes staring back at me. This time, from behind a cluster of golden cane palms in the garden 15 meters from my window. This time, however, I yelled in shock, startling the creature that sprang off into the night. Let me tell you how relieved I was that I didn't have to sprint to my room this time. I just had to leap into my bed. After this, I haven't seen anything like this again. This experience was pretty weird, and is why I mentioned having trouble sleeping. It could very likely just be my tendency to sleepwalk. On a couple of occasions, I've woken up on the lawn beside my house. Not sure why, but it's an awfully daunting feeling to wake up outside on the ground, somewhere you don't remember falling asleep, and even worse, with a small rock embedded in your arm. You know, like when it had been sitting there for so long that it kind of sticks to your arm. I woke up because the rooster started going off. The sun had just started to come up, and it was mostly dark still, so I went inside through the back door, which, by the way, was still open, and went to my room for a couple of hours of sleep. The second time this happened was on the same lawn. I woke startled because the sprinkler had started and I was sprayed. I felt this uncomfortable familiarity with the situation. I got up and went inside for my second shower of the day. This morning I was in my bathroom. The window overlooks my backyard and I had the window open. I kept hearing somebody outside call my dog's name. They kept saying Monty, calling out as if to get him inside. When I listened closer, the voice sounded exactly like mine. Same tone, same deepness. It sounded as if it was coming from my own backyard, or perhaps a neighboring yard. I looked outside and saw nothing. No movement, no person, no dogs. I got a chill, and after a minute, the calling stopped. I figured maybe it was my mother, although the voice sounded identical to mine. When something scary happens, you try to rationalize it, you know? So I made my way downstairs and past my mother's room, where she was getting ready for the day. I asked her if she had let the dogs outside. She told me she hadn't been downstairs yet. When I went downstairs, Monty and my sister's dog Ruby were both laying on the sofa, exactly where I had left them when I went to the bathroom. I know it sounds insane, I do, but I also know what I heard. I heard my own voice calling out to my dog, as if trying to get him inside, which is a regular occurrence. I don't know if this is paranormal or a glitch in the Matrix or something else, but I'm still rattled about it. Two years ago, I can't explain it, but I got this feeling like I wanted to visit the cemetery. I felt it had to be that day, that place. My boyfriend came over. I told him and he tried talking me out of it, saying he had a bad feeling, but ultimately decided he would drive me if I was really set on going, which I was. By the time we got there, the sky had grown dark, started to rain, and the wind had a biting chill to it. I was set on my mission though, and got out of the car, which my boyfriend refused to leave. I felt odd, nervous and calm at the same time. There was a charge in the air from the rising storm. The gravestones lit up from the headlights, and the full moon between the clouds. Walking towards where my family is buried, I had a sudden urge to go to the farthest part of the cemetery, where the older graves rested. I turned on the light on my phone and made my way behind the graves, closely to the tree line to avoid disturbing the peace. I tend to look at my feet when I walk, and I was doing just that when I got the feeling I was being watched. An uneasy feeling lingered at the base of my neck. I had walked for a while and could no longer see the lights of the car. I began to point my phone around, behind me, towards the trees to my left, and the grave sites to my right. I froze at the sight of it. Seemingly hovering above the stone marker, the creature whipped its pale head around, which sort of glowed a faint eerie blue. Its face was void of any features, except for slight indents where its eyes should be. As my light touched it, it revealed a mouth full of thin teeth and let out an ear-piercing shriek, sinking to its hands and feet in a crouch and disappearing into the thick of the woods before I could blink. I was still for a solid 5 seconds, trying to comprehend what I had seen. It finally processed, and I turned to run as fast as I possibly could back to the car. I was out of breath and seeing spots when I reached it, dove in and shut and locked the door. My boyfriend, bewildered, asked what was wrong, but I shouted over him to drive away right now. I watched out the back glass to see if we were being followed. Sketching the creature as soon as I got home, I recounted what happened over and over, trying to disprove myself what I thought had happened. I could find no logical rationality to explain it away. I saw what I saw. I put it from my mind though, not wanting to dwell on unseen things, and haven't visited the cemetery since. Last night I was watching Netflix, an episode in Volume 2 of Love, Death and Robots, The Tall Grass. I was rapt the whole time, clenching a pillow to my chest, mouth hanging open, palms sweating. I had seen those creatures before, or one of them, and decided to turn to Google to see what I could find out about them. My search led me here, and seeing so many testimonies made me want to share as well. Thanks for listening. These two stories are the ones that no one ever believes in. I'm a little worried that this would be perceived as a fib or embellished, so I hope you all don't think that. Again, all we ever did with Farm Boy was play. In this day, I decided we would play a board game and told my sister to grab it while I set our room up for it. My little sister has always been small. She was like a little tater tot when she was young, so she had trouble getting our board game as it was high in the closet and had to get a stool. She was still trying to grab the game by the time I had finished setting up our space. For some reason, I had just stood there, watching her struggle to get it for a good minute before thinking maybe I should help her. To my horror, she slipped, due to being on tippy toes and wearing socks. And it felt, in that moment, as if time slowed down. She fell backwards, but she didn't fall right. Instead of straight plummeting down, she kind of floated before both her feet touched the floor, as if someone picked her up by the hips and set her down. She shook it off, and the game we wanted fell down by itself. She ran over to it, grabbed it, and smiled at me, saying, "I got it, we can play." The same thing happened when we were jumping off the stairs. Basically, who can jump farthest and skip over the most steps. I already made it all the way down the stairs and told my sister to try. She grinned and did that little kid squat when they think they are about to make the biggest jump. But again she slipped. Her body was wide opened. Think of a skydiver with hands and legs outward from the body. And we made eye contact as we knew this was going to hurt a lot. Again, time seemed to slow down, and I swear I saw two hands and arms push my sister's chest back up the stairs. She wasn't that far from the top, maybe 2 steps away. We just stared at each other. "Did you see that?" I asked. "Whoa," said my little sister. We said thanks, giggled, then played something else. Not gonna lie, writing this out makes me wonder what the heck kind of kids we were. In the summer of 2018, when I was 12, me and my family decided to go to Bulgaria for a week. I have 2 little sisters, so we booked a special family room. The room had 2 floors. On the first one, there was the bathroom and 2 beds where my parents and my little sister, 5 years old, were sleeping. Upstairs, there was a 2-person bed where me and the older of my 2 sisters, 9 years old, were sleeping. The night before we needed to go home, I saw something very strange. I woke up to go to the bathroom. I went downstairs, turned on the lights in the bathroom. The lights were right above the mirror, and the light was very dim. You could only see yourself in the mirror, and the rest of the bathroom was pitch black. I looked in the mirror to wash my face. The bathroom door was on my left, and there was a small hole. Right as I was about to splash cold water on my face, I had a small heart attack because I saw a shadow in the hall, standing there, looking at me. I looked at it closer in the mirror, but the strange thing was that the shadow didn't disappear like the ones I saw out of the corner of my eye at home. I rubbed my eyes to see if what I was seeing was true, and I saw it even better. I calmed down a little since the entity seemed like it didn't want to harm me. I just stood there for 3 minutes, looking at the entity. I looked closer at its face. It was a male humanoid entity. I even took a pic of me in the bathroom looking at the ghost in the mirror. I got the hallway, but it was all pitch black. After I took the pic, I looked back at the entity to see if it disappeared, but it was still there, watching me. I was thinking to turn off the lights and take a picture again, but I was too scared to do that. I didn't even use the toilet because I didn't want to take my eyes off the ghost. I was thinking that if I would do it, the ghost would somehow come right behind me or something like that. I was in shock. Since I was really tired and couldn't stay there anymore, I had to muster up the courage to look back and run upstairs. I took a deep breath, turned back, and nothing was there. I looked back into the mirror, and there was nothing too. I ran back upstairs without looking back and covered myself with a blanket. It was 4 a.m. and I was really tired, but the idea that a ghost appearing right in front of my bed kept me awake. After half an hour, I fell asleep. In the morning, I told my dad what happened, and he told me that something strange happened to him too. He told me that something was pulling the blanket off him, but he could not turn to see what it was. I still don't know what the ghost wanted from me, or my dad. I'm really sorry that I deleted the picture of the hallway. Well, it didn't end here though. The ghost followed us home. That night, after we came home, I had sleep paralysis and saw him. He was looking at me, but the view was blurry. He was screaming, but it was so inhuman. It was like a goat screaming or something. After I was able to move, I was sweating. I was really tired, but finally was able to sleep. In the morning, my dad told me that he saw the ghost but couldn't move. He had sleep paralysis too, but he somehow drove it away. He told me that while he was watching the entity, he said in his mind something like,
"Leave us alone and don't come back."
This is not exactly what he said, but he told me that it wasn't him who said that, like something forced him. Then he was able to move and the ghost never bothered us again. I still don't know what the ghost wanted from us. So this happened about 2 years ago, in kind of upstate New York. I say kind of because I'm closer to New York City, but outside of Westchester. It has woodsy areas and inner city areas. Before we lived together, we both lived with our parents. It was about a 15-20 minute walk if you took the regular sidewalk, but there's abandoned railroads that basically create a shortcut. These tracks to me are scary because a lot of homeless people live there. Not that I'm afraid of homeless people, but I don't want to bump into one on abandoned tracks in the night. There's also been violent crimes that happened on them, and a semi-famous serial killer has even killed on these tracks in the early 90s. Basically, as a kid, I was told to stay away from it, for obvious reasons. So fear of this railroad was inflicted on me at a young age. Anyway, he was walking home from my mum's one night, and calls me, breathing heavily and freaking out, telling me he saw a skinwalker. I had literally no idea what these things were until he told me, and I honestly thought he was making things up. His description: hunched over, naked and pale, big, piercing, reflective yellow eyes, and very, very skinny. His height was about 5'8", head regular size, mouth regular. His arms and legs were longer than his body. He was naked with absolutely no clothing on, no hair, literally almost identical to Voldemort from Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings Gollum. It had a deep clicking sound that almost sounded like a growl And when the thing noticed that he noticed it, it let out a huge shriek, at which point he ran the rest of the way home. I don't believe him, but he's a tough guy, and I could hear the fear in his voice. So I was concerned and did some research. Maybe 2 days later, in the day, we were walking in a different but close area of the tracks and found a pretty much newborn baby deer dead with a piece of its backside pretty much ripped out. Like something grabbed it and ripped a chunk of its body out. It was sad and terrifying because there's nothing in my area that would have done that, and birds would have picked at its entire body, not just a small part. A day or so later, the entire body of the baby deer was gone. That's the moment I believed him, and when I started joining communities on crawlers and cryptid creatures. For a quick bit of background, after my father left the military, he worked in aerospace and frequently had to visit different countries. My mother and him lived in Bitburg, Germany for a year or two. They lived in an old building next to the base. This happened before I was born, and my mum has told this story a few times, as it was an experience that made her believe in ghosts. One evening, my mum was doing dishes. The kitchen had a door at the end that led downstairs to the ground level. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a man in uniform just outside the window. Thinking it was someone from the base looking for my dad, she opened the door to find no one standing there. She freaked out and called security. They arrived and she described the man she briefly saw. One of the guys said, and I'm paraphrasing,
"Oh, you saw him? Yes, he has been around here for quite some time."
They then went on to explain that this building they were in had been remodeled from part of a hospital that was active during World War II. My mum had seen the ghost of this German Nazi officer